Since 1617, the 100-year anniversary of Luther posting the 95 Theses on the door of the Castle Church at Wittenberg, there have been Reformation celebrations across Germany, and Christians have made pilgrimages to Wittenberg and Eisenach, Eisleben, and beyond. The very trip that we will be taking together to walk the Luther Trail has been popular for centuries. But one of my concerns as a historian and teacher and church worker has been to emphasize that the story of Luther is not just for those who call themselves Lutherans, but for all of us who have found that the gospel, the free forgiveness of sins on account of Christ alone, by grace alone, through faith alone, is ours. Some of you might be Lutherans, or, well, we've collected a lot of names. Maybe you're a Protestant or Evangelical, Reformed, Baptist, Episcopalian, Methodist, non-denominational. This is a story and a trip for all of us. And we start with Luther. That's right to do. But after spending a few amazing days following Luther, we take the trip into the broader Reformation movement. As a matter of fact, when I came on board at GTI and started fleshing out this trip, one of my first ideas was to make this a trip that looked at the whole Reformation, the big story. And so we do that as we leave Saxony and head down into southern Germany, and then make our way into Switzerland to see how the story continues. Let me give you a bigger picture of the Reformation in a nutshell. You can think of it like this. Luther kicks off the movement in 1517. He's excommunicated by the Catholic Church. Remember, he didn't want to leave. He wanted to reform from within. But then others start to ask how they might take these rediscovered gospel truths and apply them to where they live and to their own context. Places like Switzerland and France, and eventually into England. Let me make the first big distinction when it comes to those groups that broke from the Roman Catholic Church, if we want to know kind of who is who in the zoo. The first break is in the church between Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic. That's in 1054. While there are other groups, this is the big split. And then from 1517, we see a break. This is the Protestant Reformation. But part of the deal with this Reformation movement is that there is no authority outside of the Bible. They say sola scriptura, or scripture alone. And what this would mean practically is that the church wouldn't have a singular human authority. And as you can imagine, this would lead to division. So let me break it down for you. In the 16th century, in Europe, we have the basic distinction among churches of the Reformation. We have the Lutheran, we have the Reformed, and we have the Radical. Let me explain. There are those, especially in the German and then Scandinavian lands, who follow Luther and his successor. They have confessions of faith, like the Augsburg Confession of 1530, or a collection of writings called the Book of Concord, made official in 1580. The people that follow those are the Lutherans. Meanwhile, as Luther's ideas were spreading out of Germany, there were other like-minded people who called for reform in other places. And in many ways, they were taking the same basic idea. We are saved by faith alone, that we don't need a mediator besides Jesus, that the Bible alone is sufficient for our understanding of God. And these people developed a similar theology. We can refer to many of these Christians as generally Reformed. They might take their lead from figures like John Calvin or Huldrych Zwingli. These are the Christians whose ideas from Switzerland and France make their way into Scotland and England. You might hear names later like Thomas Cranmer or John Knox. While there are variations with all these churches, these Reformed bodies tended to move further away from their Catholic ancestors. Lutherans would often only remove what they believed to be absolutely necessary from Catholic traditions, only change what absolutely needs to be changed. Where the Reformed are much more willing to take the church down to the studs, to tear it down and then build back up what they believed the Bible to teach. For this reason, the Lutheran churches might look Catholic, whereas Reformed churches are going to have their own distinct look. We will see this throughout our trip. What the Lutheran and Reformed had in common is that they were often institutions that had the backing of a local prince or ruler. If you remember Luther and his elector, Frederick, and then there were other magistrates who supported the Lutheran churches. The Reformed, initially in Switzerland, had the backing of the city leaders. And later on, as the Reformation moves into England and Scotland, it too will have the crown's backing. And so we have these first two branches of the Reformation, the Lutheran and Reformed. And we call these the Magisterial Reformations. These were national movements led with the backing of the magistrates, led with the backing of government. And then we have the third branch, the so-called Radical Reformation. Radical because it tended to go a little further, and radical in part because it didn't seek the backing of a magistrate. The radicals didn't see the government or state as something to convert, but as something to flee. For centuries, European Christians lived under what they called Christendom. Christendom is a fusion of church and state that goes all the way back to the Emperor Constantine. But these radicals, whether by choice or not, weren't backed by the local government. And so this would lead them to develop their church and theology however they saw fit. And of course, this would make them suspect, and so many were persecuted, and many ended up fleeing. If you've ever heard the story of the Mayflower coming to America, you know the story of this radical group. Roger Williams, the famous Baptist, was a radical, even too radical for those first pilgrims. Today we find this radical tradition alive and well in many of the Baptist and non-denominational churches. All three of these branches, Lutheran, Reformed, and Radical, come from the same root, the historic Christian faith, and the belief that we are saved by grace alone, through faith alone, on account of Christ alone. All three traditions believe that the Bible alone is our authority for doctrine and life. Your church might be Lutheran or Reformed or Presbyterian or Baptist or a local non-denominational. But the story of the Reformation is for all of us. We can see in Luther a spiritual heir and then trace these ideas not only throughout church history before them, but then up to the present age. There's a reason that ancestry websites are a multi-million-dollar industry. We want to know where we come from. And one of my favorite things to do on this trip is to help you tie your own faith and your church life back through time and to find that Luther isn't just for Lutherans or Calvin for Calvinists, but as Christians, these are people we can see as like us in many ways and unlike us in others. On this trip, it's my hope that our understanding of the church gets so much bigger, that we see ourselves in a long tradition of people who got it right, people who got it wrong, people who fought about it, Christians like us. We'll see a family resemblance and come to rely even more on those same ideas about God and grace and His church through space and time.